for a lot of you, it's not a full knowledge, it's maybe a refresher, a little addition or something like that. One of the Vietnam vets, I think, anyone might be in the room, looked at this card, saw the title, "Know Before You Go" on this talk. He said, "Wouldn't that have been nice?" So unfortunately, it was not the case. As you know, the U.S. have got involved in Vietnam here for a variety of reasons, and we'll see what we can do with it today in about an hour. So, great. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, okay, sure. So we'll see what we can learn today, or remember, or maybe tie some things together that didn't make sense at the time. I'm not saying they make sense today, but maybe, who knows? All right, if you want to go to the next one. So, okay, asking me to talk for an hour about anything is a challenge. So I asked Sharon if she was going to serve the breakfast. Unfortunately, no. Anyone wants breakfast to talk? Okay. Coming to Shaler, of course. The war ended, so to speak, about 50 years ago, a couple weeks ago. About 56% of the current U.S. population was not born. When you add in an extra 10 years or so of memory, you start getting into the 60s and 70s of people who weren't even around, much less could have fought in it. Now, we certainly have a couple of Vietnam vets here, and obviously a lot of people who remember it. History is very important. The old saying is, history repeats itself. The newer saying is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So you need to know the rhyming pattern to see what's likely to come up. So maybe that's a good thing. This is an internet picture of an adult classroom, so that's what we are here today. We're in an adult classroom. We're going to go over the basics, and the basics are always what? Who, what, when, where, how, and why. I'm going to divide that up because I don't think we can fully answer why or how come or what else or what if, right? You can do a little better on some of those up there. I'd like to get into some themes, but I definitely want to make sure that we cover all the basics first. But some of the themes would be, for example, like the anti-war protests, the notion of a draft, the POWs, Agent Orange. There's more of a theme than sort of an actual specific event at a specific time, although whatever. So we'll see how far we get there. So okay, so all right. So go on to the next one. So none of these can be fully answered in an hour. Maybe we can get some headway, whatever, sort of whatever this. So it's good so far. So all right. Let's see where we are. Go ahead. Okay, so the basics, I sort of got into this already. We're going to have to sort of divide these up into that. So those aren't basics, right? Those might be a little more basic. All right, so very quick question: where were you? I don't necessarily want answers. I already got a couple answers. A decent number of veterans in the room. A couple Vietnam veterans. A couple more Vietnam era veterans who were not in Vietnam, which I think is an important part of the story. About 26 million males were of draft of military age during the Vietnam era. Only 9 million served. 16 million more didn't serve than served. And of the 9.2 million who served, 2.8 were in Vietnam. So this is the 101st Airborne in Vietnam. That's a big part of the story, of course. That's a military exercise in West Germany around the same time. More people were in the military, not involved. Those are a bunch of construction workers having their lunch sitting up on top of an I-beam, which is sort of maybe a little more hazardous than what these guys are doing. These are college students, ordinary average, mostly Janes, but a couple of Joes. I got that. That says that was from a special ed. They're teaching, they're learning sign language. They're training to teach deaf kids. This is class of 1969. A decent number of people were at this event, figuratively and literally, as we know. A lot of people were living the suburban dream. About 1960, about 180 million people in the U.S. It was about a third suburbs, a third urban, and not all urban was urban poverty, and about a third rural. Now that's a farm. Anyone grew up on a farm? Okay. About 15 million in 1960 were living on farms. By 1970, 10 million were living on farms. So that's how significant of a draft that is. Of course, most people in the United States today, this is a twinkle in the eye, or they were a twinkle in the twinkle of an eye. And most people alive today weren't even around then. But this is, where were you, where were we, where was the country? So go ahead. So what about Vietnam? It was divided in the middle right about here and was called the demilitarized zone between North and South. They each have roughly 16, 17 million people, but this is population density, very heavily in these two river delta areas. Even though the city itself, called Saigon, only had 1.5 million, and Hanoi 1.5 million, this area down here had about 10 million. This is the population density of South Vietnam. See how coastal it is, very sparsely populated out here. A couple of cities up here. About 10 of the people there, and I think this gentleman here was in the Mekong, right? So, okay, so this was the most heavily densely populated. The U.S. had 180 million, just by comparison. Laos and Cambodia, as I think most of you would know, were off on the side. Laos is completely landlocked. Cambodia is down here. They got involved in the war, as we both know. They were all collectively part of French Indochina. But as you can see, their populations, even at the time, were vastly below Vietnam. Vietnam today is like pushing 100 million. Vietnam is huge today. And even at the time in the region, it was a very dominant force. Okay, go ahead. So a metaphorical where for Vietnam, about only 10% of the people lived in cities. This is how most of the people lived, right? And this, I think, is very significant down in your area, the river notion, that they're transporting by river and the rice paddies and everything like that. But there were cities that had cars, and there's a little hard to see, there's a stoplight up there. Of course, those had sampans. And so this is what Vietnam looked like at the time. So, okay, go ahead. So this is the physical size, and you can see it's pretty substantial. It's long as Vietnam. It's actually larger than Great Britain, the British Isle, the main British Isle there, which I think is pretty interesting. As you can see, this would be northern Vietnam, so you're dealing with Minneapolis and you're dealing with New Orleans down here, and they didn't have, didn't really have a nationwide rail system or an interstate highway system. That's a pretty hefty haul. So a lot going on. There could be a lot going on in that area. There could be a lot going on in the U.S. in that area, but certainly even more so in Vietnam in a certain sense. Where is Vietnam? Next slide. Where physically is Vietnam? Almost literally halfway around the world. If you do from the east coast of the U.S., the longitudinal lines of longitude, it's almost exactly 180 degrees opposite there. Down here in Southeast Asia, people will recognize Australia, New Zealand, the central, there's Hawaii, of course Japan, the Philippines, China, Soviet Union, Russia, Korea. Down here in Southeast Asia, along with Thailand, Malaya, Malaysia, Indonesia, that's where it is, other side of the world. All right, so we definitely want to do a conventional history of the war, dates, battles. I encourage you to pursue that significantly. I'm going to get into enough of that to do justice to it. But who was fighting the war? Who was fighting the war who was fighting against each other? U.S. and South Vietnam, by and large. Anyone else join in? Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, South Korea, People's Republic, Taiwan sent some troops. So there was sort of a collective effort. But Canada, 30,000 Canadians volunteered. So that's significant. But they weren't officially involved. Britain, France, Italy, all those NATO allies were not on the U.S. side. Who was on the other side? The North Vietnamese.
Chinese.
The Chinese. Where did North Vietnam get its stuff? China and Soviet and Russia.
China and Russia.
Now there were two. The enemy was divided. The other side was divided into two major military aspects. One was called the Viet Cong, who were mostly southern Vietnamese who were guerrilla warfare. The other was an NVA, the North Vietnamese Army that had come in from the north. They were better trained, but they weren't locals. But okay, so this becomes, if you really get into the war, it becomes sort of an interesting difference here. So, all right, I'm going to go into a deep history of who these people are. So when you go into deep history, you always start with the Big Bang, right? So, okay, so then we'll get to, okay. I set up a timer here of 10 minutes. I'm going to blitz through the history of the universe in 10 minutes. But I think it's important to get to where things were when the Vietnam War started. Okay, go to the next slide. All right, we'll start with agriculture. Agriculture 12,000 years ago in these areas, agriculture makes a huge difference in human societies. You can massively produce food, you can create cities, You need to keep records of things, so you have written language. You can have major population explosions. Let's do 12,000 years ago. Let's say 1,000 years is 1 year. We call 1,000 years for 1 year. I'm going to bring this up when we get into adolescence in a couple minutes here. All right, so we're going to blitz through here. We're going to go up to Alexander the Great, who took over all this region and made this sort of Greek culture, which then gets taken over by the Romans. All right, go ahead. Okay, trust me, okay? So then the Roman Empire splits. The Western Empire falls apart. The Eastern Empire largely maintains that Greek characteristics, which eventually transmit north to a place called Russia. The Russians take their history from the Eastern Roman Empire. If you ever listen to Vladimir Putin, who is crazy, but he talks about this. So you need to sort of know this. The West falls apart. The Western Europe takes from the Latin Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and everything, but it falls apart. This is the Islamic conquest. You will notice that they took most of Africa, all this, but this Eastern Empire stays together. Where am I going with this? The East-West split that in the 20th century between Russia, Soviet Union, and the West is centuries old. Communism and democracy is sort of a manifestation of things that have been going on for centuries. So, okay, go back one more. This is the most backward place on Earth in 1444. It's called Europe. Completely divided up. You'll see the only large empires are sort of in Spain and the Ottoman Empire and even Russia. Completely backward place, 1444. But a lot of things are happening under the surface. Go ahead. We got the printing press coming up. We have overseas exploration. We have the Protestant Reformation, early signs of it. This is the beginning of the modern world, right? It starts in the 1500s. You will see 100 years after this debacle, European people are all over the world. Now, like colonies, South America to a certain extent, mostly trading ports, but within 100 years, this European thing has gone all around the world. If you remember 12,000 years, 1,000 years, if you take 10 kids in a local school who were all born on exactly the same day, May 18th, 2013, today is their 12th birthday, you can imagine that they're not all at the exact same stage of where they're going to be, that they could be off by a little bit. And at that point in time, it makes a huge difference in their lives. When they turn 34, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. But you know what I'm talking about when things start to happen when you're 12 or whenever they start to happen. If you want to look at the history of the world, you could say that Europe was like premature puberty. All of these things that we associate with the modern world hit Europe before they hit other places, to the extent that they've even hit other places 500 years later. Go ahead. Common misperception that all of the Indians were the same. No, there were many tribes, and if you think about the perception that we're going to make later in Southeast Asia, they're all the same. No, they're not. The Vietnamese are not the Cambodians, are not the Montagnards, are not the Koreans. Okay, so just history. Where was the action in the Americas? This is the slave trade. And at that time, any given 100 people would produce roughly the same economic output. South America and the Caribbean were vastly superior to these hicks from the sticks up here. This is the amount of slave trade that came across the Atlantic. The U.S. had this this was nowhere. These goofballs up here were just losers. All the action was down here. The Europeans thought this was where the action was. So go ahead. Okay, so a good example. Later, Europe sort of fights among itself for 250 years. This is Africa in like 1850. This is Africa in like 1900. In the late 1800s, the second phase of European colonization goes out around the world. And now you have steam power, now you have telegraphs, now you have machine guns, now you have modern sanitation. So they take over, the Europeans colonize what's left of the world, including Southeast Asia. This is when the French get heavily into Southeast Asia. This is when Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, becomes French Indochina, right? So around this time, it's just a little easier to show it. This is like 70 years. That's how much colonization happened in the late 1800s. All right, so it's called the Scramble for Africa. All right, so there's a difference. Settler colonialism is when your people go in and just take over the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. An empire is a little different. The French couldn't possibly go in and just take over Vietnam and just kick everyone out. So you set up deals with the locals there. Most of these empires were operated that way. India is a perfect example. And then, of course, Southeast Asia. So the French, when they colonized Southeast Asia, went in, made deals with the locals, converted their rice, took over a rice plantation and turned it into a rubber plantation, which you can't really eat rubber, you have to sell it, you have to participate in a commercial economy, and this is, of course, enormously socially disruptive. There are a lot of people who don't like that. You'd rather be poor your way than wealthy someone else's way. So this is happening all over the world. It's still happening today. So if you want to go there, so who about those hicks from the sticks? They're doing all, they actually, they don't have anything going for them, so they start their own little place here. And things turned out reasonably well. Early 1800s, there's an important era in US history, symbolized by John Quincy Adams, who at the age of 13 was a minister to the court of the Tsar in St. Petersburg, and Andrew Jackson, who at the age of 13 is a prisoner of war in the US Revolutionary War. They were born weeks apart in 1767, but their life paths are symbolic of what was happening in the US in the early 1800s, the westward motion. It is a complete mistake to say the age of Jackson is nothing more than just enslavement going west. There's a lot more going on. Most significantly, instead of looking back to Europe, the US starts to look west and takes over the continent, right? See, the manifest destiny. This also leads to a significant amount of isolationism on the United States. I think we're all aware that there's a lot of people, I don't care about them, whatever, that's Belgian Congo, let them kill each other off. I'm not saying that maybe that was a little harsh, but there's just a significant amount, that ain't our deal. Middle America here is just not into foreign wars, and I think this becomes very important. Go ahead, yeah, so. All right. Two latecomers to the European story are the United States, who gets really involved in overseas colonies in the late 1800s. Not universally popular. A lot of popular objection to that from those isolationists. And the Japanese, who are sort of coming on strong. China's in decline, so they start expanding in the Pacific. And all this European blows up in this great European civil war, which I think you know something about. Everyone gets involved. Finally, the USA gets involved. It is the complete end of all the European empires, except, go ahead, that the US in and saves two of them. It comes in and bails out Britain and France for all practical purposes. Italy now also starts to want to jump in at the last minute. They start expanding the Mediterranean. Mussolini a little later. So there's the Paris peace talks where they're figuring out all this around the world. President Wilson has these highfalutin ideas. World safe for democracy, self-determination of peoples. These three don't care in the least. They just want the power. They just want the money. They just want to get bailed out. But they have to play his game because the U.S. is now the world's strongest power. So they sign off to all this. Sure, we'll sign that. I had no intention of doing it. Some guy who took him seriously was this guy, who's probably the single most important person in our whole story. His name is Ho Chi Minh. He was, like many, educated by the French, went to France, started to learn all these ideas. He goes to the Paris Peace Conference and says, why don't you set us free? We're an independent people. We're the Vietnamese. They say, no, not you people, us people. The smart people, the white people, right? So he gets told to go pound salt, and he goes back to Vietnam. So all right, so he starts a guerrilla warfare against the French in there. Go ahead. Yeah. So the treaty was a complete disaster. I think a lot of you know a lot of this. Things don't get any better. The Russian Revolution, there's anti-colonial movements all around the world. Things are in a state of collapse. They collapsed with the Great Depression, although they were sort of heading that way anyway. We have one surviving democracy in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, which was signed off. Stalin's industrializing Russia at the cost of several million Ukrainians and political opponents, like he just killed. So that isn't real good. And Hitler and the Nazis take over. They rearm Bosnia, Czechoslovakia. Go ahead, World War II. We can't tell this story without telling World War II. When does it begin? Japanese take over. Who knows? I don't know. We don't know. It could begin as late as Pearl Harbor when the U.S. finally gets involved, right? So anyway, World War II comes along. Go ahead. All right. So The U.S. makes all the difference. The massive industrial, productive agricultural capabilities, the massive manpower, pardon the gender, but that's true, safe space that's free from axis attack, and there was a national determination on the part of the United States to see this through. Does anyone remember World War II? It'd have to be at least in your late 80s. Is anyone old enough to remember World War II? Okay, all right. You?
Well, yeah, I was born in 41, so
okay.
I just remember rationing and, food. We had blocks of cheese that were donated by the government.
The advanced age of
pork
4.
in a 1-gallon tin. Lard, what had a little yellow capsule in it, and my mother would mix that capsule to make it look like butter.
Yep.
Yeah, things were tough. Gas was rationed. Tobacco was rationed. People would switch ration stamps.
To switch ration cards.
People who didn't smoke drove.
Think of this guy, he was 4 years old, so this is the impression that this made on him, right? But what comes out of all of that sacrifice, all of that suffering? Go ahead. So people could see as the war was being fought. Look at this. This is the population of the U.S. Over 10 million people were serving. Amazing. But you could see on a map. This is the summer of 42. This is the spring of 45. Most of the Pacific was now back in U.S. hands. This is the summer of 42. Most of Europe's in German and Axis control. By January 145, Germany's just on its last legs. Everything you had to go through was paying off, right? I mean, people could see it. Ordinary average Joes and Janes. It's extremely expensive. There were thousands of deaths, but it worked, right? I mean, they set aside the goal. Go ahead. Okay, so you could just see just every time, if you were Rip Van Winkle and you slept for a month and woke up for a week, you would just see this steady progress and all this sacrifice. All right, go ahead. So it was just barely 3 years after Pearl Harbor when the most single famous picture of World War II was taken. That is U.S. Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima. No one in 1938 knew where Iwo Jima was. Everyone in February 1945 knew where Iwo Jima was and knew someone who had a kid on Iwo Jima. There's a lot of symbolism in this. You can't see anyone's faces. It could be any soldier out there. The Navy was starting to be integrated. It could even be a black person. One of the people, 7 we know, was an American Indian. The flag is not fully raised, but it's going to happen. This is 3 years and 2 months after Pearl Harbor. It's going to happen. Now, maybe these should have been the most famous pictures of World War II. That's a Nazi rally, that's a concentration camp, that's Japanese murdering people in Nanjing, that's the atomic bomb. But that is certainly the most famous picture of World War II. And it says a lot. 3 years, 2 months, 18 days after Pearl Harbor. Who won? The guys won. Yay! Welcome home. Well done. Let's get busy. Let's go to the baseball park. This is a Norman Rockwell from the late 40s where this guy's putting all these TV antennas, and way in the background you see the church steeple. I think there's some symbolism in there about the new religion. All right, so we won. Wait, now what's going on though? We do all this hard work, and then all these communist governments in Eastern Europe, there's the Berlin airlift, the Berlin blockade, the Soviets get an A-bomb, China goes communist, there's the Korean War. And then there's the belief that none of those people could have done it on their own. There had to be people collaborating in the United States to help them out, the Big Red Scare. If you remember how proud it looks when you all win the war, it wasn't. Some of the best World War II movies that came out of World War II were made right after the war. This is a bunch of ground guys during the Battle of the Bulge just shooting around. And this is the best years of our lives, about 3 guys coming home. And It's a Wonderful Life is really a World War II movie. Made right after the war. Jimmy Stewart was a World War II vet. So it wasn't, these guys didn't have it all good, and they had a lot of nightmares, and they drank a lot, and they had a lot tough time finding jobs, a lot of them. So, but the perception was we win. Go ahead. So, all right, a brief interlude here. Dan Rather. On October 2nd, 1986, some guy came out when he was waiting for his cab, started punching. What's the frequency? Kenneth, you got the frequency wrong. You got the frequency wrong. Punch, punch, punch. Kenneth, get the frequency right. The frequency's wrong. So later, REM, the rock group, makes a song of that called What's the Frequency, Kenneth? It's sort of a joke, whatever. So what's the frequency? That's where we today, when we text, we get the WTF, right? Doesn't it stand for what's the frequency? To varying degrees of politeness, people during this whole story start to ask what's the frequency in various formulations. So a little interlude there. So people are asking, what's the frequency here? You know, you've got the Korean War, Joe McCarthy. You got the duck and cover because the other side has the bomb. You have people being sworn in, including a guy named Elvis Aaron Presley, right smack dab in the center there. Gets his draft notice. He gets drafted like everyone else. But a huge amount of prosperity, peace at home, general peace in the world. You can travel. You got rock and roll. You got people making cars. You got people buying cars. You got airplanes. You got people going to school. You have poverty. You have Willie Mays playing stickball in Harlem with kids out on the street, so that those kids can grow up and be him when they want to be. You have people going to the beach, and you have kids in school, and you have Dick and Jane. Yes, very Northern European normative, but nonetheless, this was the society that the U.S. is in the 1950s, which I think leads up to the war. What's going on the other side of the world? The French lost Indochina during World War II because they couldn't occupy it. They go back and try to reclaim it. The Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh say no way. They defeat the French at a place called Dien Bien Phu, which leads to the Paris Agreements, makes an independent Cambodia and Laos. Vietnam is divided into North and South, and there's going to be elections to decide this. So the U.S. supports it, but the problem is that Ho Chi Minh is in the North, and he's going to win any national election. So the U.S. says, we can't have an election in our great support of democracy. We can't have an election because we know who's going to win. So the U.S. supports the South and starts to send military advisors. Now we're getting into Vietnam. Thank you for your patience, but I think we needed to do the preliminaries. All right, go ahead. So the great paradox of Dwight Eisenhower's administration is that from 53 to 61, he was determined to prevent the outbreak of the Third World War. He had seen the Second World War. He said, I'm going to do everything I can to not have a Third World War, because he remembered what the Second World War was like. But if there was a war, there was no doubt who was going to win that war. He had so many chances to start a war, and he just didn't. But if there was a war, we knew who was going to win. So when he leaves office, this is the U.S. is set up, can win a war. Can go ahead. Okay, so this is I call this the great anomaly in U.S. presidents, because these three presidents, they served a total of 28 years combined, which can't happen again with the 22nd Amendment. Trust me, it cannot. And these are regularly ranked as three of the greatest presidents in the 45, 46, 47, depending on how you count, by historians. I don't think anyone ever gets ranked below 8. They're always in some as high as the top 6, those three in the top 6. This is an anomaly. The U.S. doesn't have 3 great presidents in a row for 28 years. But we think that we should. This is an anomaly, right? Okay. These people were not perfect, as we know. And during the 30s, when asked whether or not the U.S. should be supporting the government of Nicaragua, headed by a guy named Somoza, some of his advisors, who had just won a civil war against the Sandinistas, if you go into the 80s, his advisors came up to him and said, sir, you can't support that son of a bitch. He looked at him and said, no, I know the guy's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. This says a lot about post-war U.S. foreign policy, that the U.S. doesn't get involved directly, and Eisenhower stays out of it with U.S. troops after Korea and gets out, but he starts to support a lot of people who aren't real nice people because they're our not real nice people. So that's sort of an interesting play here. So, all right. So the U.S. is committed to South Vietnam. Why? Because they're the Democrats. They're not communists. If they fall, everyone else will fall. I seriously doubt no one's walked into this room without ever hearing of the domino theory. I think that if Eisenhower had to not say one thing ever again in his life, he would not say that. But we have to contain. After the Soviets took over Eastern Europe, the policy became containment. We can't push them back, but we can stop them where they are. So we stop them in South Korea, we should probably stop them in South Vietnam. Don't let them get any footholds. So in this context, go ahead. larger world events, just skip the next slide. All right, so these are just some important people who were on the Vietnamese side during the war. That is Ho Chi Minh, who I think is most important. He becomes the leader of Vietnam when he gets old and he dies. These are the two generals. This guy was the general in the south. This guy was the general in the north, Giap. And this guy is the guy who negotiates the Paris Peace Accords with Henry Kissinger. When the U.S. took over the South, they didn't really have one, so they dragged out an old emperor called Bao Dai until they found this guy, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was the president from 55 to 63. He was actually. Does anyone see anything interesting visual about their portraits and how they're dressed?
Western.
These guys are all Western. These guys are all peasant, right? So if you want to, I didn't realize this until I put all their portraits up here. But the North, they had the peasant support. These had all the urban support. These all had been French educated. He was a Roman Catholic, actually. His brother was the Bishop of Hue, basically the Bishop of Vietnam. And he had all these contacts with the French, with the elite, with the business people. But the peasants weren't on his side. He becomes the president of South. These guys were frenemies throughout the rest of the war. Get into that a little later. But I just think the visual of these guys were clearly the Western, the French influence. These guys were, at least they had the look of the peasant look. So, all right. So Diem becomes president. He's not doing real well, actually, but he's the best we got, or he's our SOB. These are the two famous speeches when Eisenhower warns against the military-industrial complex. In his final address, Kennedy gets sworn in, so we see the transfer of power here. So what changes, if anything? Next slide. Not really, not much, other than the fact that the U.S. just doubles down its commitment in the South during the Kennedy administration. Who's this guy? Secretary of Defense, Lyndon Johnson,
McNamara.
Robert McNamara. He came from Ford Motor Company, so he was a businessman, so he was into numbers. So, well, worked in the big one, we'll just send in more numbers. We sent US 2.8 million total tons of TNT in World War II, did the job. So we need to send in more bodies, we need to send in more tonnage, we'll just send it in. That's sort of his business mentality. On the ground, people were not happy with Diem. These are anti-Diem protests in the early 60s. I was on a Zoom call with the veterans the other night. And apologize for doing this, but we'll get to the war and we'll go pretty quickly. There's a lady on who was a colonel in the U.S. War College. And she was talking about lessons learned from Vietnam. If you take all that stuff that I talked about Europe and its Christian heritage, and its science, and its belief in right and wrong, and you take all the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world is culture to them is far more important than right and wrong values. We don't think it's right to take an example. There's not enough money here. Let's burn the bride. We think that's wrong, and we view that as a right or wrong issue. But certain parts of the world would view that as this is our culture. We didn't really realize that for most of the world, culture is far more important than right or wrong values. Now, he's French, he's Catholic, he comes in maybe with that mentality, he's trying to institute these things. The people aren't very happy. Go to the next slide. All sorts of things are happening around the world, the Bay of Pigs, okay, you can see all these things. Of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Late in the summer of 1963, the protests are completely out of control. You probably recognize that guy, there was the Buddhist monk who burned himself. Oh, a really good friend of mine's calling me, I'm sorry, potential spam calls, sorry. The US orchestrates, the Buddhists are really unhappy with Diem, so they assassinate Diem. The CIA organizes an assassination of an ally. I don't know if turnabout's fair play. I don't think it is, but we all know what happened about 8 weeks later. So we got a new president coming in here after JFK is assassinated. Does anything change? Not really. South Vietnam, there's 2 or 3 more military coups in the next 2 years. It's very unstable. LBJ comes in, he wants a huge domestic agenda, but it's also an election year. Who was he running against in '64?
Goldwater.
Barry Goldwater. Was Barry Goldwater, would you call him moderately liberal, progressive by today's standards?
Super
Bomb 'em all.
So Johnson doesn't want to appear weak going into this election. Something happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. Wasn't really a big deal, but the Johnson administration blows it up into they need a Pearl Harbor to get the U.S. into Vietnam. It passes both the House and the Senate with overwhelming. That is the legal justification for the U.S. going into Vietnam. It's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, August of '64. All right. You can argue that after this, the war begins. Now we get to the war. These are troop strengths: 23,000 in 1964, 187. So this is big, right? These are the people who died. The U.S. Marines land in Da Nang in March in the first U.S.-only operation. Later that year, there's a major attack on the Cambodian border in the Ia Drang Valley. That's a U.S. operation. That's one of the first offenses of the war. The U.S. is bombing North Vietnam in what's called Operation Rolling Thunder. There are significant targeting restrictions. They can't bomb anything they want. As you can see, we got to look at this. 23,180. Wouldn't it be nice if your investments did that? Okay. The other side, the Viet Cong, were the locals in the south, and the North Vietnamese army. The North Vietnamese get supplies down through the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which goes through Laos and Cambodia. Don't forget, Laos is officially neutral, right? Okay, so no, we didn't get it. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. So I forgot that. Okay. Yeah, Laos is neutral. In 1962, all the great powers of the world, and the Vietnamese and the Cambodians, got together and signed the agreement on the neutrality of Laos. The Laos is completely neutral. Isn't that nice? Anyway, so obviously Laos was very heavily involved in the war. All right, so this is a bunch of crap on paper, which a lot of stuff is. All right, go to the next one. So, like I mentioned, the U.S. was ready for war. Or maybe a better way to say it is when you look at what was happening from World War II to '65, the U.S. was ready for a military conflict, but maybe not a war. You could be drafted. A lot of people were drafted. There was the army you could serve. You'll know what the reserves are. I shouldn't even mention that, right? So you have all these people you can call up in the National Guard. These are the army ranks, and I know there's some army people in here. The generals at the top in the officer class, like lieutenants, colonel, majors, captains, colonels. Then at the bottom you have privates, corporals, sergeants. Who runs the United States Army?
Sergeants make it.
Sergeants, non-coms. These guys in the middle here are the people who get things done in the United States Army. Business world's run by secretaries, the Army's run by sergeants. It's not that major who comes along you have to salute, who thinks he's important because he can smoke a cigar. No. These sergeants are the things that get things done. The Army, historically in the United States, has been considered to be one of the most democratic institutions in the United States. Sounds a little strange, but it really is. Because these are the people who make things happen. These might be, they never went to college, they're 26 years old, they're in 8 years, they know their stuff. You come right out of college and you get bars here. You got to listen to what these people are doing, right? Right?
If you want to live, then you leave it.
Sergeants run the Army. Why do I say this? Because when you're drafting all these people for this war, you're starting them either here at the bottom or here at the bottom of these officer ranks. The strength of the Army of the United States, which is larger than this, comes from these people who've been 8, 10, 12 years, who know their stuff, who know how to bring these kids up to speed, who know how to answer to these people and get what they need to do done. The U.S. never called up the reserves and the National Guard for a variety of political and legal reasons. All those extra troops you sent in were draftees or regular Army people who went in, who had just signed up thinking, I'll do my 2 years, and all of a sudden they're on a plane to Vietnam. This was a serious mistake in the war. That the United States, right off the bat, remember World War II, everyone went. No, we're already starting off with a situation we're sending only a certain category of people in. So that, right away, that doesn't sound good. Go ahead. All right. So it wasn't ready for a war. So 66, 67, look at this. Notice how many troops and how many killed in action, all right? At first, there's popular support, but there's growing anti-war protests. Does anyone know who Jay Fulbright was, famous senator from Arkansas? He starts to have hearings. They're closed hearings at first. They're not in the public, but he's starting to ask in D.C., he's a Democrat, and so is Johnson, starting to ask, what's frequency, all right? Because it doesn't sound good. You also have suburbanization going on in the home front. You have a lot of riots in '67. The tactics U.S. was using firepower, just blow them away. And the VC and the NVA were using guerrilla hit and run in what's called hug. They'd find a U.S. unit, they get right up next to it, like 100 yards away, so that the U.S. couldn't come in with artillery, helicopter gunships, planes bombing from the air, B-52 bombing from 10 miles out, because the enemy was so close. It was called hugging, that all this firepower wasn't being put to good use. So the U.S. had to sort of change its tactics and sort of do this. It's expensive, it's ugly, it's painful. This is Lyndon Johnson going to visit, who's that guy? William Westmoreland, Commander of U.S. Forces in South Vietnam. It doesn't seem like it's going really well, right? Okay? Unbeknownst to us, there were other people. If you go back to that couple slides of the Vietnam people, you just do it in your head. They were starting to get nervous too. The North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, there's only so many 15-year-old testosterone-laden sons of rice farmers you can pump up to go just get shot. The NVA was having a tough time getting supplies down the trail. Hate to say this, it was probably working. Ugly as it was. Now don't forget, we're 3 years into the war, which is about how long as that flag on Iwo Jima was. It was probably working. Many false starts doing things like that, but the war was probably working. So they had a big conference in Vietnam, all late '67. Ho Chi Minh and the two generals got together, and the one general said, we got to go all in, we got to set up, we got to lay low for a while, get everything ready to go for one big major operation. The people in South Vietnam will jump on board with us. It will win the war. We got to roll the dice, because we're not going to win this way. The North Vietnamese general said, no, it's going to fail, trust me, it's going to fail. They went, I think you know what happens here. 1967 leads into 68, so what goes on? So other things were happening. War on poverty, civil rights, the space race. These are housing starts, automobiles, sports. So this is the home front. So a lot of stuff is going on 66, 67, like the U.S. answered the British invasion of the Beatles. We got our monkeys. So we're back on, getting up there. So a lot of stuff's going on in 67, 68. You all know what this is. That massive invasion that the enemy planned, that the U.S. didn't see coming. And it was a complete surprise to the United States. All these villages erupted in cities which had generally been safe in the South. Everything comes to a head at Tet. This huge thing in the middle of the winter in 68, the Tet Offensive comes along. All right. This changes the whole war, caught them completely by surprise. All over South Vietnam, cities, villages, that's Hue. I'm going to get into a little bit. It's a city, that's an ancient city that gets taken over. The U.S. Marines have to come in. Hue is a good example of this. Tet catches completely by surprise. And in the cities, that's where the TV cameras are. So everyone's seeing this at home on TV. This is live on TV, right? All right, so after we were told everything's going well, now everything falls apart. It was a complete military disaster for the Viet Cong. The general who said it's going to fail was completely right. The U.S. got caught by surprise. The U.S. and the South Vietnamese, the ARVN got their stuff together. They found out where it was, these little cells of VC, and they wasted all their ammunition. It took months and months and months to bring everything down, and it was gone in 2 weeks. It was a complete military disaster for the North. There was no popular uprising in the South, but all the action was caught on cameras. This is one of the top 2 most famous pictures of the war. We won't show the other one. I think many of you recognize that the head of the Viet Cong in Saigon was captured, and the chief of the police of South Vietnam walked up, and there was both a still photographer there and a video camera there. He just walks up, I don't know what to do with him, shoots him in the head, kills him right there, live on TV. Not live, but ended up on TV. All those kids we were sending to our schools, I pledge allegiance to the flag. You have the right to remain silent. Anything, a right to a fair trial by your jury. This isn't what we taught. We're teaching these kids. You recognize this dirtball? Charles Manson. A mass murderer. This guy's a murderer. There's no question. He's a murderer. What was the trial? 15 months long or something like that? So not saying this didn't happen in other wars, but it just didn't happen on camera, and that isn't what we thought we were supposed to be about as a country. Walter Cronkite comes on and basically says at the end of February, he says, I see no way for a victory. We aren't going to lose. It's going to be a long, protracted stalemate that goes nowhere. All right. Hue. Early February, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese took over the city. The U.S. Marines counterattacked, building by it's a city. The Marines were generally out in the field. By the end of February, the city is reconquered. This is a video. I wish I could do the video thing. These are actually Marines at the end of Hue. They're walking out. They genuinely have, after their exhaustion, they have genuine smiles. They're not faking smiles. They see a cameraman, they look over and they're smiling. These guys are genuinely proud of what they did in Hue, such that the South Vietnamese could re-raise the flag over Hue. About 3 years after the Marines first got there. Go to the next slide. 3 years, 2 months. Raising the flag, the Marines on Iwo Jima. About 3 years after the Marines get there, the South Vietnamese are raising the flag on Hue. But these aren't the same picture. All the sacrifice, all the hard work, everything, it's going to happen. All the sacrifice, all the hard work. What's the frequency? Hasn't made a poop's been a difference. This is the perception that was happening. Roughly the same time after Pearl Harbor that the U.S. Marines went into the Danang. Go ahead. So you can't, I almost should stop here for a variety of reasons, but I won't, but nonetheless, that is what the difference was between the war that had been fought 25 years earlier that everyone was behind and the war that was being fought or half fought or fought with an army behind the back. Those two flags really symbolize a lot. So everything, so can we go, are we done yet? I think you all recognize him and what happened to him on April 4th back here in the United States. Go ahead. Okay, 68 is a presidential election year. The Republicans don't know who they're going to nominate, although in the end, actually the guy who finished in second place was actually Ronald Reagan, but we all know. All right, it's time for some sense here. There was a third party involved, George Wallace, who was not only about segregation. He was sort of the man on the street, like, he was the Archie Bunker candidate. What's going on? We got to blow him to kingdom come. Who was his running mate? Does anyone know who his running mate was? He got like 13% of the vote. He probably cost Hubert Humphrey the election because most of his supporters were gut-type people who were probably sort of blue-collar Democrats. Who was his running mate? Does anyone recognize the name Curtis LeMay? He was the head of the Strategic Air Command in the 1950s. I think during the campaign he said something about we need to blow them back to the Stone Age. 13% of the vote. Now we have to do something very interesting. We have to switch over to that other slideshow. Can you switch? There's another slideshow if you X out of this one. Is anyone tired? I think the U.S. was. I think when we get to this point, I think the U.S. is pretty tired. Does anyone remember 68?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Both where you were. You were in 68 in Vietnam. 69. Did you think you were going into anything that had any value?
No.
Okay. Who knows? Maybe in 67 you might have. Okay. Does anyone remember the riots, of course? You remember the 68 Democratic Convention? Chicago. Who did they blame for the war? Who did the students blame for the war? Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? So Humphrey was never really the world's biggest war supporter, but he gets tied in with Johnson. Who was the peace candidate? First of all, who was who else got shot in 68? RFK. There's no guarantee that he would have won the nomination, but he was clearly he was assassinated too, right? The Democrats show up to the convention and the vice president takes over. Who ran the convention? Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, the old school, urban, blue collar guy, and there was the police, the protests and everything. who was the peace candidate in '68 for the Democrats? Eugene McCarthy, not Joe, but Eugene, right. So the Democrats are in disarray. Nixon comes along claiming, I have peace with honor. About a week before, the LBJ announces that there might be a peace settlement. 4 years earlier, he's running for president against Barry Goldwater, so he needs to be tough. Gulf of Tonkin. 4 years later, his successor, Hugh Humphrey's running for president. 4 years, now he needs to be the peace guy. There probably was never going to be a peace settlement. We know that Richard Nixon, behind channels, used his contacts to try to convince the South Vietnamese government, you'll get a better job when I'm in, you'll get a better deal. How do we know that Nixon intervened? I think, isn't that the Logan Act that a private citizen isn't allowed to conduct foreign policy or something? How do we know that Nixon contacted the South Vietnamese through back channels? Because Lyndon Johnson had his campaign playing bug. So it's things like this, right? Nixon wins, barely, close, but he wins. So he comes into '69. There's a picture up there. Are we good? So.
I don't see the difference.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. All right. Let's see. I'm gonna. I had two slideshows and instead I just tried to merge them. Go completely down. Go to the other one. Go to the hub one. Is there a hub? Yeah. Okay. Don't worry. Okay. Don't worry about it. Okay. So, what some people consider to be the most famous picture ever taken in human history is when Apollo 8 was going to the moon, and they were just completely. It's up. We'll try to get it up here in a second. But I think you've all seen it. But they were just so busy getting to the moon and doing looking out and getting their gauges, and they got close to the moon. They were trying to get telescopic and get the pictures and everything. And they went around the moon, and what did they see? Christmas Day, 1968. That picture. Some people would say that's the most famous photograph ever taken in human history. It's a picture of the Earth from the other side of the moon. So that's what we saw on Christmas Day. So isn't this great? So 1968 is over and we see the planet Earth. It's the age of Aquarius. Let the sun shine in. Did I misread the history? What changed? What changed when JFK took over from Eisenhower? Not much. What changed when LBJ took over from JFK? Not much. What changed when Nixon took over from LBJ? Not much.
Vietnamization.
I'm sorry?
Vietnamization.
Yes, he did. He wanted to say the U.S. needs to get out of this. This is a Vietnam Civil War. His Secretary of Defense named Melvin Laird came up with a plan. He said, we're going to de-Americanize the war. Public relations expert got hold of it and said, not a good word. It's called Vietnamization. Let's teach the South Vietnamese how to do their own thing, right? Okay, so the war gets Vietnamized. So little by little, but very gradually. It takes a long time. U.S. troops in '69 are almost at the level that they were in '68, when some of the highest combat going on with nothing in sight, no end in sight. The one thing that did happen was that there were actually serious efforts at peace talks. For a long, the U.S. and the North Vietnamese and whatever wouldn't get together. They finally get together, but they had a little issue getting started. Does anyone remember how the peace talks went nowhere for like 8 months?
Couldn't agree on the table.
Couldn't agree on the shape of the table. Because if you have a round table, everyone's equal. If you have sort of an elongated table, you have sort of a head of the table and the people on the side.
Sounds like that.
So arguably, maybe they weren't serious at first, but they were just sort of trying to pretend. So, okay, so, yeah, if you go through here to about slide number 19, just go to where the Earth comes around the side of the moon. They're very similar, so. Hey. All right, let there be peace on Earth. All right, so go to the next slide. So, okay, so 69 comes in. Thank you so much. Sorry for that, my bad. I put in here, I would love to, and I knew that I wasn't gonna have time. These are all themes that we can discuss. We can discuss the Army as a theme, Agent Orange. environmental movement, music and movies about My Lai, the massacre, Project Phoenix, the CIA assassination program, the moonshot. People were tired. We get the Watergate. These are all themes that come up during the war that we're not going to have time to get into in the detail. But we can. They're there. So go to the next one. U.S. troops. So there's the Vietnamization. Are all parties at the table? On June 24th, 1969, Life magazine publishes 1 week's worth of U.S. fatalities in Vietnam, with names and ages and hometowns. Joseph Stalin made a comment that unfortunately is probably true. The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic. And when all those numbers just kept coming back, I hate to say this, they were numbers. When you see all these faces, which I think is a huge amount of the significance of the wall, it just, this is the real human cost of of whether or not you have a round or a square table that you're sitting around. People are dying. People are losing their legs. People are spending the rest of their lives having nightmares when you're going over this CRAP. So they published that, so that obviously inflames the anti-war movement. Go ahead. Is this country at war? Obviously, these people are in battle. But the U.S. is going to the moon. That's the World Trade Center is in New York City. That's the steel building. All these resources are going into this. All these houses are being built. That's Woodstock. The Super Bowl 69, Joe Namath, Bill Russell's last game as a professional, Game 7. Canadians and St. Louis Blues in the Stanley Cup. No, none of them came from the U.S., but nonetheless, this type of manpower and these resources, the amazing Mets. Is this country fighting a war? I mean, I'm genuinely asking this question. Was the U.S. really fighting the war that it needed to be fighting? If all that other stuff was going on while those people were up there doing that under the flag, I'm asking this as a genuine question. Was the U.S. fully behind it? Go ahead. So protests, huge protests, right? Nixon gives a speech in November '69 that actually sort of stabilizes some things. He says, and so when we look at the demonstration, I need to reach to you, the great silent majority, to stand up. So Congress gets all these letters, all these pro-troop stuff. We need to see this through. Didn't last very long because the draft system goes to this lottery. It's no longer like any sort of selection thing. It's based on your birth date. Was anyone here born on September 14th? That was number one. Number one draft pick was September 14th. If you were born on September 14th, you were certain to be drafted. So a lot of people knew they were going to be drafted. They signed up to try to get some better terms. Does anyone else remember what might have been a lottery in recent times that we didn't have to go through? A life or death lottery? COVID vaccine. Remember at first there was talk we won't have enough vaccines, so we're going to have to give it out in a lottery system. They did it. Okay. 1970, contraction and expansion. There is a steady reduction of U.S. personnel going into the war, coming out of Vietnam. It's just going down, 100,000 a year. That's actually happening. But to really, the generals are really on him. Sir, all this stuff's coming in. We can't stop it. We can't stop it when it comes in. We've got to stop it at the gates. So he orders an invasion. He goes along with an invasion of Cambodia, which leads to the Kent State protests on May 4th. So obviously, a lot of people in the U.S. thought things were really falling apart, and maybe with good reason. 2 of the 4 who were killed were not in the demonstration. One was an ROTC student. The person who was permanently paralyzed was sort of watching from a distance, and a stray bullet hit him. Not that there should have been any bullets anyway. This students shut down universities all across the country, and of course these are all the draft people, and some of these had number 6 and some of these had number 366, so it didn't, so whatever. This was an interesting thing that happened several days later. Speaking of construction workers, anyone heard of the Hard Hat Riot? There were all these anti-war protests going on with all these college students, and these construction workers in New York City. I'd like to think they were building the World Trade Center, but I don't think they were. They organized a counter-protest one day. They got tired of these kids. So they got a bunch of American flags, and they went into an anti-war demonstration, and they broke it up, and they came in, said, get a haircut, get a bath, get a job, get a clue, get a life. So this sort of an interesting pit, that this was still part of what the ethos of the United States was, despite all of these protests. There were still a lot of people who thought somehow this country has to support itself. I find that interesting. It's an interesting piece. Obviously, there were a lot more anti-war protests.